boundaries for yourself. And if you know TT ain't gonna be with it, then sometimes TT gotta go.
I mean, and sometimes the family barbecue, the barbecue, as we like to reference the community on social media.
Yes.
The barbecue invitations have to be adjusted a little bit, if not timed appropriately.
Yes.
So people are showing up on time for the lesson.
Oh, but I love it.
We're live. We've been caught in the middle of conversation. I had to tell Dr. Sullivan how incredible her book was.
Thank you.
But welcome back to Lit Friday, Augustonians. My name is Jessica Lanay, the host and curator of Lit Friday. If you are new to the program, Lit Friday is a virtual conversation that happens on the final Friday of every month. We feature writers, thinkers, and artists of the African diaspora for hour-long chats about their work and how it connects to contemporary issues. Tonight, unfortunately, is our last Lit Friday for 2024, but we will be back with you in February of 2025 with Dr. Etta Fields Black about her new book on Harriet Tubman, and also with a new structure and more amazing guests. Lit Friday will undergo some changes to make the program more engaging, efficient, and visible. So keep looking out for our 2025 season and follow the August Wilson African American Cultural Center on Instagram at August Wilson Cultural Center, or you can follow me on Instagram at hanginthere_kitty. Before we introduce our incredible guests for the evening, we're going to synchronize our calendars. Currently on view at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center is the exhibition Collections in Black, a celebration of Black comic book culture curated by the wonderful Kimberly Jacobs. If you want to know more about Black comic history, know more about the different aesthetics involved, please go. And even if you're a well-seasoned Black comic book fan, there's something there for everybody. There's going to be a gallery talk on October 26th at 1 p.m. Don't miss it. You don't have to register. You can just show up and enjoy. On October 29th from 6:30 to 7:30, CC Calhoun from the August Wilson African American Cultural Center welcomes Dr. Denise LaRosa for a reading and conversation about her children's book, Empty Shoes. Visit awaacc.org and learn about and register for our remaining events for 2024. There are even some wonderful evening events coming up in November. And without any more waiting, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan. I pulled the longer bio because it's all worth telling everybody. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, PhD, is the author of 3 books: Big Girl, a New York Times Editor's Choice and winner of the Balcones Fiction Prize and the Next Generation Indie Book Award for first novel. The next book is The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, winner of the William Sanders Scarborough Prize from the MLA. And the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the Judith Markowitz Award from Lambda Literary. In her writing, she experiences the links between language, imagination, and bodily life in Black, queer, and feminist experience. Her stories and essays have appeared in Best New Writing, The Kenyon Review, Callaloo, Feminist Studies, American Fiction, Prairie Schooner, Crab Orchard Review, Tri Quarterly, GLQ Lesbian and Gay Studies Quarterly, American Literary History, The Scholar and Feminist, American Quarterly, Public Books, Ebony.com, TheRoot.com, BET.com, and others. So Dr. Sullivan is not hard to find. Go look, read everything, bring it all together. A BBC Radio 2 Book Club pick and a New York Times paperback row selection, Big Girl was named a Best Books feature by Time, Essence, People, Vulture, Miss, Goodreads, Booklist, She Reads, The Root, Library Reads, Glamour UK, Vogue France, and others. Her work has earned support and honors from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Yaddo, Hedgebrook, Malay Arts, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Mellon Foundation, the Center for Fiction, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Born and raised in Harlem, New York, she is a professor of English at Georgetown University and lives in Washington, D.C. I think that is amazing and incredible. A scholar and creative writer after my own heart. This book is such as we were speaking before, I said, it's good when whole sections read like they came directly out of your adolescent diary, when they read like your own experiences and you can just feel that full body response inside of you. It teaches, it loves, and at times when it's necessary, it also hurts, especially when it's time to think. I appreciate you making time for us and being with us.
Of
And we
course.
can't wait to hear you read an excerpt from the book.
All right, let's do it. Jessica, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. Also, just thank you for our conversation as we were getting set up and kind of getting into this. You know, we were talking about just the kind of power of literature and the power of reading, right? And, you know, it's funny you mentioned feeling like a book is sort of connects with your own life story and might have come out of your journal. Journaling is a big practice of mine. And in some ways, this book did sort of come out of my early experiences with writing, in writing my own story. So eager to get into that with you, but I'll read a little bit. So I'm just going to read from the midpoint of the novel. At this point, Malaya is 15 years old. It's 1996. And what you really need to know in terms of backstory is just that her family has been living in Harlem. Harlem is in a kind of intense process of gentrification. Harlem is growing, is changing, is sprawling, is hot and contested, as is Malaya and her body. And so this is where we pick up in her teenage years. The scents of black coconut and African pear oils wafted toward Malaya from the tables that lined the street. As she walked, the smells of fried and jerk chicken, roti and rice pudding, platanos and candied yams seeped from the storefront restaurants, mixing together like the ingredients of a gumbo. They spilled over Malaya as she moved down block after endless block, veering inward toward the stores to make room for a hurried dreadlock man in a hoodie, then outward to avoid colliding with a cluster of children giggling in bubble jackets and scarves. She fingered the 3 purple braids that hung from her left temple and made games for herself as she walked, trying not to imagine what 125th Street thought of her, this double-wide block of black girl, streaked with color, bounding toward the big and tall men's section of Harlem jeans. The melody of TLC's newest ballad drifted across 8th Avenue. In the alcove between the Apollo Theater and Tsitsi's African hair braiding, a cassette bootlegger pumped Shabba Ranks' deepest reggae bass line onto the street. Malaya could hear these songs blending with laughter, catcalls, arguments over the prices of African masks and homemade soaps. A Black Israelite man stood on the corner of Frederick Douglass, shaking a leather-wrapped arm at passersby as car horns and sirens rang somewhere around 123rd. Children snickered as Malaya pushed through the crowd, and an older man shouted, "Whoa," when she passed him, splaying his arms and making an exaggerated leap backward out the way. Through all this, she pushed through the blocks on her own now, her ears warmed by the foam pads of her CD player, listening to a music that seemed to have been made with her in mind. Her favorite was a song she had discovered 2 years ago in the 8th grade and claimed as her personal anthem, an introduction to her newfound idol and kindred soul. "It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine." The track was an irresistible tale of rags to riches, chronicling the rapper's rise from blinding despair into unfathomable technicolor hope. The artist was a big Black man from Brooklyn with a lazy eye and a face as soft as chocolate frosting. His body puffed like a pouch of Jiffy Pop beneath his chin, and his voice was always thick and smooth, as though there was a scoop of ice cream perpetually lodged in his throat. Malaya loved the way the man told his success story, how he so prized the vestiges of hard living while casting the present as a gorgeous and unending feast. His album was full of all the things Malaya's mother hated and many of the things her father prized, sex and death and hope and fantasy, all mixed together like a compote, baked into a hard but secretly sweet crust. Malaya loved the paradox of the rapper's moniker, Biggie Smalls, how it was intimidating and diminutive at once, how it said so simply so many of the things she'd been feeling these 15 years of her life. When Naila, her mother, saw the CD, Ready to Die, lying among Malaya's Sharpie markers and gel pens, she arched her eyebrows and asked, "So this is the message our artists are sending the youth now?" Her father, Percy, only shook his head and said the album reflected a new generation's struggle, and that it was their job as parents not to understand. There was something insistently unexpected in hip-hop, and it entitled Malaya to become unexpected too. It meant she could be angry and tender, sad and hopeful, a Black girl besotted, full of feeling, wearing lipstick and big men's clothes. She turned up the volume on her Discman and let the beat cover her as she pushed toward the big and tall. "How you living, Biggie Smalls? And mansion and Benz is giving ends to my friends and it feels stupendous." "Big woman," the cherry-colored man at the bag check counter exclaimed as she cleared the threshold. He rounded his arms into a sumo wrestler pose. The acrid stink of new plastic bags smacked forth as Malaya pushed her way into the store. The man had become an uncomfortable acquaintance by now. He always looked friendly enough, but he had wet old eyes that seemed to catch on her body and drag away only full seconds after he spoke. He was short and squat with a thin scar that curved along the side of his cheek. I remember you. Do you have a husband? Yes, Malaya said plainly, taking the bag check ticket. I told you before. The man acted as though she hadn't spoken. So big, he continued. Healthy, but you have a pretty face. I'll call you big girl, pretty face, he concluded. But his eyes raked her stomach. Each time someone told her, you have such a pretty face, she felt as though they wanted to sever her head from her body, to discard the meat of her and save the small, round disc of her face as her one saving quality. She was supposed to be grateful for his attention, and in spite of herself, she was. This was what angered her the most. These conversations made her uncomfortable, even sad, but she needed them in a way she couldn't find words for. She imagined her foot uprooted from its plot on the ground, striking the man's cheek way above the counter with a cartoon style, pow. Instead, she smiled politely and said, thank you, and put the ticket in her pocket. You give me your phone number when you leave, okay? The man's voice trailed behind her like a curl of stale smoke. I'll stop there.
I remember reading that section, and I remember the vividness of it. I lived in New York for a while, and so moved there in 2012, roughly. And so remember that last transformation of the city.
Absolutely.
I was living on Broadway and like 120th, and I remember the last few months of some of those places existing. Absolutely. I remember studio apartments for $900 a month disappearing in 6 months.
Exactly. No longer.
You're picking up on like this early trajectory, this long generational process, this transformation. The world is different for Malaya at this point than probably more different than her parents would have ever imagined.
Right.
And so I wanted you to say more about that generational shift, because the book is very much in the 80s, begins in the 80s, where there's this strong sense of respectability politics coming from the women in Malaya's family. Absolutely. And now at this stage you've just read, we see Malaya's mom, Niela, and her mom, her grandma, responding to this in all of these ways. And Malaya's processing it through how the world receives her body. Could you talk more about that connection, that transition, and how the body stands in for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So I do see this novel as about transitions of various kinds, right? Again, there's a coming of age sort of narrative. That's a transition from childhood to adulthood. In Malaya's case, it's from girlhood to womanhood, right? But also her family is very much in transition. We were talking earlier about a kind of like class shift, right? So her father grows up working class, grows up in Harlem in the projects. Her mother also grows up working class, although with a different sense of a kind of like class aspiration in a certain way, right? So this family is a family that's sort of moving through social space. And Malaya's, arc of coming into herself as a teenager is happening alongside that. They bought a brownstone, right? In the late 1980s, they move into this brownstone in Harlem. Home ownership sort of represents so much for both of these figures, the mother and the father. And Malaya is sort of born into this, legacy, this experience where a lot of the kind of class stuff is being sort of fought out along or so on the grounds of her body. And so maybe we can get into that in a little bit, but in terms of that transition, the neighborhood is also in this transition, right? You're absolutely right that, there's a kind of, on one hand, this sense of a kind of respectability. Absolutely, the women in Malaya's life, they really want her to be a proper woman. And for them, that means a thin woman, or at least a thinner woman, right? Of course, that's also what that means for themselves. And so Malaya internalizes a lot of that. Part of her transition is needing to kind of like let go of that inherited body shame. But, watching the neighborhood shift and change in some ways is a kind of comfort for Malaya. And so, I like reading the scene that I just read because we see her sort of like inhabiting the neighborhood and really feeling her body. She's enjoying moving through the space of the neighborhood in her body, even as she's also observing how the neighborhood is perceiving her, right? And the kind of like, negative way she's seen when she takes up space. She still lets herself enjoy it. And a lot of what allows her to do that is the music, right? The music sort of insulates her, protects her. It gives her a kind of inward focus where she can enjoy her body's rhythms, its movements, its desires, etc. And it's a kind of safe space to experience all the transitions that are happening around her, but also within her. And, my hope is that as the novel goes on, we see her become more and more empowered to sort of choose the direction she wants to go in, instead of being sort of at the whim of all of these different trajectories and plans and paths and ideals that are circling kind of around and on her.
There's also this aspect of, like, I think Malaya kind of enjoying this shift from being forced to go to like Weight Watchers meetings at churches in her youth, where she continuously hears, and I remember hearing this, what is it? Nothing tastes as good as being thin feels.
It's something.
How pervasive, like, this phrase is, no matter your race, no matter your class, like, if you grew up at a certain time, you heard it.
You heard it.
And then we also have this second wave feminism as it's represented in like SWV, TLC. You're not too proud to beg.
That's right.
You're not too proud. You're not too proud to express your sexuality.
That's right.
So she's all in the midst of this, while, it just seems like there's this breakthrough happening because the world and Black femininity is changing, but it's associated with this access to kind of masculine things like the clothing that she tries on at the store. Could you say more about this interplay? Because I was thinking about, what is it? Black, Lesbian, and White America by Anita Cornwell. And she makes this statement in that collection where she's like, fat Black women are always associated with masculinity. And this, in part, is the masculinization of the Black feminine form on white standards, but it's also based on just what you have access to in the store, which is pain. And so as I read, I was like thinking around this space. And as the writer, you can give us the insight. So I wanted to know more about this idea that's so pervasive with heavy bodies and masculinity, especially when you're thinking about Black culture.
Right. Well, there's so much there. And, it's true, as the writer, I can give you my insight in terms of, my perspective as I was crafting this story, but also my sort of thinking through as somebody who thinks a lot about gender and bodies and race. But also as a reader, I appreciate your perspective. And I tend to agree. So I think there are a few things. First, your point that, I think it's important to kind of start from the space of understanding that normative gender was never meant for Black bodies, right? So our bodies have never been sort of normal or perceived as normal. This is in some ways where we get this sort of pervasive insistence on respectability from, right? This sense of sort of wanting to meet an external and often impossible standard of a norm, especially in the US and in spaces where in Black communities that have experienced legacies of chattel slavery, where, if your historical legacy is being perceived as 3/5 of a human, your body is never going to achieve, right, or meet whatever expectations of normalcy of any sort, including a kind of gender norm. And so, that I'm thinking, of course, with Hortense Spillers, with Cornwell, with Patricia Hill Collins, right? I mean, it's like, in some ways, this is sort of like a core concern of Black feminist thinking. And, I just named scholars, and we were talking earlier about scholars and theorists, but it's also in Black women's novels, right? Like this is not that different from what Pecola Breedlove is going through, right? How can I be the right kind of girl if I will never have blue eyes? You know what I mean? All of the women, all of the colored girls and Ntozake Shange's for colored girls, right, are also trying to figure that out as well. When it comes to the conversation about body shape and size, right, and what big bodies, fat bodies, plus size bodies, BBWs, all the language we have, right, to kind of describe, the kind of largesse, right, of Black women's bodies and the bodies of Black women of size, I think you're absolutely right. This is yet another sort of vector, right, another kind of, another sort of intersection of difference that on one hand is vulnerable to that same kind of stigma, right? If your body doesn't meet a kind of gender standard, not only because of race, but also because of size, then some people are going to go, even harder at trying to meet that standard. And I think this is what we see happening with Malaya's mother and grandmother, right? So they're like, okay, if we're going to be, her grandmother says, if, we have to act like ladies, even if we're big as men. And so a particular performance of femininity that is obviously deeply sort of steeped in a kind of heteronormative, heteropatriarchal view of gender. This is the goal for the women in Malaya's family and many of the women in her life. But to your point, there's a real joy for her in being like, actually, forget that. There's something else I'm going to try to do. And hip hop plays a big role in that for her, right? So you were mentioning all of these figures, and some of them show up in that section that I just read. Absolutely. People like Aaliyah, right? Who we see Aaliyah with the baggy jeans and the Tommy Hilfiger boxers under the jeans, right? Very much a femme performance, arguably still deeply in conversation with a heterosexual male gaze, but also using at the very least what we might think of as like a kind of tomboy, sort of aesthetic, which I think is arguably an extension of a queering of gender in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
Left Eye, Missy, right? And so the fact that hip hop is able to do all of that gives Malaya a sense of possibility. And at the same time, as you're pointing out, then we have people like Lil Kim or Foxy Brown who are insisting on a kind of sexual self-expression. They're insisting on like what I feel and what my body feels matters. Yes. And even if that is also, available to a male gaze, the words are coming out of the mouths of these Black women's bodies. And so that offers Malaya this sense of possibility of sort of doing gender differently. And finally, then when it comes to a figure like Biggie, who she's like, okay, this is a big Black person who insists on in styling himself as sexy, not in spite of his fatness, but because of his fatness. Yeah. And that just sort of opens up a whole world for her. And the fact that there is this space within a hip hop fashion aesthetic for her to wear big men's clothes, which, as you point out, happen to be the clothes that she can fit comfortably, but she's able to style them in the way that kind of works for her identity, her gender that she's
in the moment.
Exactly. That's right. So she can switch it up. She's like, now we're doing blue hair and a blue, MC t-shirt and blue Timbs. And now we're going to do the big, whatever, Paco or Pele or whatever, she's wearing back in the day. And, but she's doing it with her eyeshadow and with her lipstick, right? So that, at a time when we don't really have, kind of robust conversations about like gender queerness or, sort of deconstructing gender binaries. That's not in the popular conversation, but hip hop is doing that in the 90s. And therefore it gives Malaya a space to do that for herself as well.
It reminds me of that, the other Biggie lyric. What is it? Black and ugly as ever.
That's right. However, I stay down to the facts. Yes, exactly.
I recalled that lyric when I read your portrait of him.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, this is the most beautiful description of Biggie Smalls. Because of course, he's a beautiful man, not despite his size, but in part because of it, right? And because of that kind of West Indian trajectory of his family and the different ways that we get to experience ourselves positively when we're around each other in an affirmative space.
Right.
There's just so much that this brings up for me. And one of the things that haunted me throughout Big Girl was this tension, right? So we have the understanding that we're in a fat-phobic world.
Right.
A world where even the medical professionals are giving acculturated care, not medical care in a lot of instances to Malaya. They're caring for her through the lens of what's culturally acceptable and not really what her body needs.
Exactly.
But we also understand that there is a weight problem here that is affecting her health that's present. And you leave the reader in this space that I'm sure Malaya's in. You leave them in that space with Malaya to live in the uncertainty, experience the uncertainty of like, well, am I unhealthy? Is this acculturated? And how do I separate the two?
Right.
Why that strategy as the author to maintain that space in an unjudged way?
Well, I mean, it's just as you said, right? It's first of all, from a craft standpoint, as the author, I see it as my job to not judge the characters, right? But to sort of like present their experiences, their choices, their desires and their goals, and let the reader sort of, figure it out. In my experience as a reader, that's kind of like, that's where reading is most sort of fruitful, right? Is when you have to get in there and kind of grapple rather than being told what's right and what's wrong. But also, I mean, even more importantly, I think these are nuanced issues. And I think they're issues that anyone who has grown up within diet culture, we've all experienced this, really, regardless of body shape or size, right? We all know what it is to sort of feel like the choices you make in terms of what you put in your body and how you move your body or don't move your body are fraught with kind of moral judgments. This is a good way to eat. This is a bad way to eat. This is a good way to move. This is a bad way to move. And that those moral judgments mean that you are fully responsible for what your body does, even though we know that's actually not how bodies work, right? Like we know from our own experience, we know from science, right? All of the medical professionals that you're talking about, they know as well. And yet there's still this expectation that, one should feel that they can control their body by the specific individual choices that they make, regardless of what's happening systemically around them. And if they fail to control their body in a certain way, that is a personal moral failure. That's what I'm most concerned with here, right? Like it's that issue, it's that experience of, again, a kind of pervasive body shame, pervasive, shaming culture around eating and around bodies. And what happens when we have this 8-year-old girl sort of caught up at the center of it? In some ways, we'll never know what Malaya's body would be like if she weren't living in this world of, diet culture and body shame, very much inflected by race and class and gender. We'll never know because that's the situation that she's in. And I think that's the case actually for a lot of us, right? Like we might never know what our bodies would look like, what our health, even the sort of our understandings of health, right? Are complicated, and there's a lot of research, I'm sure you've come across it in your own work, in fat activism and fat studies and in disability studies as well, that sort of like individuals don't actually owe anyone a healthy body either, right? First of all, health is a temporary state. And again, it's when we impose this idea of a kind of moral judgment, right? That it becomes sort of like, well, if you only were to do this differently, your body would look or be different, and therefore you would be healthier. What was important for me was to dramatize a health crisis for Malaya, but her health crisis is a mental health crisis, right? Like her physical health, she obviously experiences her body as it shifts and changes in, body mass. But the crisis for her is a mental health crisis that is very much brought on by, again, the kind of like intersecting and compounding forces of all of these, sort of judgments and stigmas and also social systems of oppression that are literally bearing down on her body, right? Like there's this weight on her that is far more detrimental and dangerous than the weight of her. And that's something that was important for me to kind of focus on as I was crafting the plot arc of this character.
Something that you also stealthily do, now that we're mentioning mental health in Malaya, is that you very succinctly connect what's happening in her mind to the act of comfort, the act of comfort eating, right? Right. And it's a beautiful demonstration of the interconnectedness of our mind and our body. Right. And we can have a conversation alone about how eugenics and Christianity meet in our society to create this moral system, these values, and even affects our ability to have universal health care, because so many people believe that they don't want to pay for the moral mistakes of other people's Black women.
Especially Black women, right? Especially like other people, especially Black women, right? And the whole notion of Black women as a sort of Black women's bodies as a burden on a national, civic, legal, cultural, judicial even structure is deeply entrenched. And I would agree, right? Eugenics, religion, also the legacies of slavery, right? And like racism writ large,
No, absolutely. And I'm also thinking about all the things that kind of go unspoken and unsolved for Malaya. I see this dynamic with consumption, if we want to return to class as the conversation, and her mother's efforts to lose weight, get into the gold dress.
Yes.
She goes and she buys a lot of things that kind of fill in the space of doing. Right. And we see that behavior alienating the father, Percy or Pra. We see that alienating the father to a certain extent. And we also see it as something that's replicated in Mamer, and we see it in certain ways with Malaya's relationship with money. Yeah. Could you speak to that connection between like self-actualization, consumption, and class, especially in the Black context? I don't think it's a conversation we have often enough, especially the weight of it on Black women.
Yeah. Oh my God, what a great question. So I want to start with this idea of Naila as somebody who is like consuming maybe in place of doing. And I think that's right. But I would also say that for her, consumption is in fact an act, right? It is a kind of, it's self-soothing, right? It is an act of sort of comfort, and consumption of various kinds, but yeah, consumption of the gold dress, for example, right? And so, the scene that you're talking about where we see her sort of looking through a catalog, they're actually on the train on the way to Mamer's house, right? And so Malaya knows what she's in for. Mamer's going to make her do, sweat into the oldies with right, exactly. R.I.P. Richard Simmons, right? Who I think affected a lot of our lives with those videos. So Malaya is sort of aware that the summer is supposed to be a time of, the ability to transform, become a new person, right? Become a new, inhabit a new body. And she sees her mother experiencing that as well. And so she sees her mother sort of, leafing through a catalog. And this prompts Malaya to think about, right, just last summer, her mom bought this dress and promised that I'm going to get into this dress before I come back to get you from your grandmother's house, right? And Malaya notices that didn't happen. The dress is still there. And in fact, even a year on, right, not only is Naila still trying to get into that same dress, but she's getting ready to buy more dresses and new dresses, right? And we, all of these. So the consumption is an effort. It's an effort, I think, for Naila to kind of continue to hold this goal in mind. It's kind of a commitment to finally succeeding at gender. You know what I mean? If it replaces any kind of action, I think the action it would replace is the action of like investing in self-love. You know what I mean? Like the action of investing in self-care rather than the action of like actually losing the weight, right? Like perhaps what I would want a character like Naila to do instead of consistently buying and buying and buying these dresses to sort of, buttress or shore up her successful gender, I would want her instead to like really do some work, maybe go to therapy, you know what I mean? And really like do some work to kind of really, refuse those ideals about gender. So, there's that aspect of consumption, but then there's the larger sort of class aspect, and it is connected, right? Naila, so as I said, this is a family that's at a kind of important point of, a class movement, right? Where like they've just purchased their first home, being homeowners is a big deal for them. And that the significance of that class experience that they're having is a little bit different for Percy versus Naila, right? So, for Naila, she has sort of felt like she's been on this trajectory all along. And she felt like she's sort of been bred for this, right? Or been born for this, been raised for this. I'm thinking back to our earlier conversation about what it means for a Black woman to be bred, right? She's sort of bred for a certain kind of class experience based on her mother's vision of class. Percy, on the other hand, he feels like he has sort of, in some ways, even like worked his way to, but also he's very sort of, grateful, right? There's this sense of a real, gratitude for the ability to kind of move from where he comes from, right? Which is, again, he grows up in the projects in Harlem. So to now own a brownstone in the same neighborhood that he grew up in the projects really means a lot to him. And so for him, one of his main concerns is that he doesn't want his family to experience lack, right? He doesn't want his family to experience hunger, in a figurative sense, but also in a very literal sense. While Naila doesn't want her daughter to experience the failures of gender that have shaped her sense of her identity and that shape her relationship with money and consumption. And so again, Malaya's body is like this battleground on which these competing ideas around class, around gender, around like success, right? Like successful family life. They both know that they want to have a successful Black family, and they want this little girl to be like, a successful, healthy, even whatever that means, right? Sort of well Black girl. But they have different ideas of what that should look like. And for both of them, consumption becomes an important part of this. So Percy is like, I don't want my daughter ever to want for anything. So I'm going to give her the Chinese food that she wants because she's a kid and she deserves to have it. My mother is like, I don't want my daughter to want for anything. So I'm going to make sure that she is as small as possible and as much of a kind of normative girl as possible. And I'm going to buy her the gold dress, right? So that she can, have something to aspire to and make that commitment to, again, normative gender. It's a complicated situation. And the last thing I'll say about this is, of course, so for Malaya, consumption just becomes comfort, right? Something that in some ways, she learns this from both of her parents, right? Like, okay, what do, if I want to eat the cookies and my parents won't buy me the cookies, I got to get some money to get the cookies. I guess I'm going to have to be swiping, bills from my mother's pocket to get the cookies at school. And and she's also saving her allowance so that she can buy the big men's clothes, right? So like, consumption is a comfort for her, but at least it's a space that allows her to center the inner landscape of feeling. You know what I mean? Like what feels good, like the cookies feel good, the Chinese food feels good. And also it feels good when the clothes fit. It feels good to wear them and to have a sense of, her gender and her sort of idiosyncratic sense of self reflected in this way on her body, So consumption it's a mixed bag, but I think that that's probably the case with all of us. You know what I mean? Consumption, we are in a consumer culture for sure, to our detriment, but also I think in ways that we end up using to find comfort, even if it's temporary and like insufficient comfort.
I also had a lot to think about when it came to how Malaya's weight, right, as a character in Big Girl and in the societies that she's in, no matter how transitioning it is, has a severe effect on her ability to express herself and create an outward identity. I actually spoke with someone who helped me at, a thrift store that specializes in plus size clothes about this book.
Wow.
They said, yes, I read it.
Oh, wow.
And we had this conversation about how many SKUs are made, how those SKUs become available, where they're available, where they're not available, and what kinds of clothes are traditionally available to plus size women or women who would be characterized as being beyond plus size, whatever that means.
Right. Which is, that concept in itself is such a mess,
Or this like mechanized restriction from a whole entire industry that couches the identity of, larger women in a certain kind of clothing.
Right.
Something that hides the body.
Absolutely.
And then I took another leap to think about the various disappearing acts that women take throughout the book during transformation and how that's narrativized in our culture, right? Lizzo recently had an article come out where everyone's like, oh, she's lost so much weight after a time away.
Right.
Nana is going to take some time away from the view of her daughter and her mother to get into these gold dresses.
Right.
Her friend Shanice, Malaya's friend Shanice, goes away and comes back ever thinner each time.
Right.
And so it's almost as if like weight has a restriction on your ability to develop a self here.
Absolutely.
And you give so many examples of that in the novel.
First of all, I want to read that essay. So if you write it, because it's such a brilliant take, you know what I mean? It's a brilliant take. I agree. I would add, though, that it might not be only that weight has this effect, but perhaps it is body shame that has that effect.
Misogyny, body
right?
shame.
Yes, exactly. Right. So like body shame as an effect of, as Bell Hooks would put it, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, sort of logics, right? And white supremacy, you know what I mean? That like, because it's not the weight itself. And I don't want to go too much into Lizzo because, but you're right, the discourse around her body as it's changing is just like bananas. It's so wild. But I think part of it was that many, many communities and many individuals were looking to her to be the one figure that we could see that was not trying to change her body. You know what I mean? And there's this sense of, and I can only imagine, what that must feel like, right? To have to be that person.
In her life, in her body.
Yeah, right? And that's in some ways that also is a kind of moralizing imposition of a certain kind of body shame. You know what I mean? Like, how dare you change? Like, what is that? But obviously there are other critiques I think that are available there. But that one, doesn't really track for me. But I think that, for Malaya, her relationship to the possibility of a changing body is one that is, in some ways, like she sees that as the goal of her life, right? Like that is her goal as a child. The one thing that she is told constantly that she should do is lose weight. And, she sees, as you've pointed out, she sees that this is something that, because of the shame inherent in this body stigma, she sees the women around her wanting to do that sort of undercover, right? Like in secret, under the protection of, removal from the gaze. And in some ways there's a logic there, right? The only problem is that also often means a removal from community, from relationships, right? From like, the sustaining kind of, life force that, makes the lives of these women sort of, better, right? And richer. And, in some ways it's the same logic of the makeover, which was very big in the 90s, right? Like
I remember that. Ricky Lake and Maury, you go away, you get juiced up, come back.
Boom. Exactly, right? You go away and you come back new. And I think you're absolutely right that that sort of like retreat and reemergence is about not only coming back in a new body or with a new style, but really coming back a new person, which is sort of, you know, read as a better person. And again, it goes back to that idea of morality. If nothing else, it's like you must have been so dedicated, so strong, so disciplined, right? Like all of these, you know, adjectives that do carry a kind of moral connotation or a moral weight. And so you can come back and be this new person in this new life. You're absolutely right. We see this happen. You know, this is what Naila is trying to do. This is also the goal for Malaya Summers with her grandmother, right?
Yes.
That again, she's supposed, and she definitely internalizes that. So she, and you know, her reference point is Saved by the Bell, right? For the OGs, you know what I mean? That like she's like, I'm gonna be as skinny as Lisa Turtle when I come back in September. Which of course is not possible for many, many reasons. But she definitely believes that like if she loses weight, if she removes herself and loses weight, she can come back as a new person, read a better person. And that somehow that will then start a better life for her, even though she has seen women countlessly, you know, and endlessly try and I'll say fail. And the failure is not in the women's efforts, but the failure is in the goal, right? The failure is that like we cannot change ourselves by changing our bodies, and that shouldn't necessarily be, you know, certainly how we spend our summers, right? How we spend when we do have those moments of retreat, perhaps trying to transform our identities is maybe not the best use of our time.
And then also intimacy, right? Mm-hmm. Intimacy around identity, intimacy around a lack of self-care or struggling to find your own method for self-care. We see the struggles of intimacy between the father, Percy, and the mother, Niela. Yeah. And we also see the struggles of intimacy between Malaya and her various love interests throughout the book. And what we learn about Malaya's situation is that she is not safe because of her size from sexualized harassment.
Yes.
Right. But we also see the ways in which, you know, Percy's masculinity does not leave space for him to communicate in an effective way, that perhaps it's hard to grow an intimacy with his wife because he doesn't understand her perspective, and she can't say, you make me feel insecure, so I can't be intimate with you. At least as a reader, that's kind of that was my guess at like the strain that was there. But then you also see it reflected in kind of Malaya's search for touch, her search for like haptic intimacy, which is valuable in and of itself, but also emotional and mental intimacy with various people. Right. And the way that you show the relationship with the body as central to that, it just unfurls throughout the novel. It's so powerful.
Wow. Well, thank you. I want to read that essay too. I mean, you know, So, okay. So there's so much in what you've just said. So, okay. Right. So the complexities of intimacy and embodiment, right? And I think you're absolutely right. This is something that all of these characters are trying to kind of figure out in different ways. You know, for Percy, in some ways, I think you're right that I see Percy as a figure he's got a kind of commitment to an ideal of masculinity, kind of, you know, not that dissimilar from his wife's commitment to an ideal of femininity.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, I think one difference though is that Percy's sort of self-identity as a father, right, and really wanting to be like a certain kind of father, in some ways sort of overrides his desire to be a certain kind of man. So he ends up being a little bit more kind of, you know, permissive, gentler, right, than we might think of as a kind of like, you know, masculine archetype, partly because he really wants to be like a good father, even though he's not totally sure what that means to him. Whereas Naila, I think, absolutely, you know, is she's seeking a kind of intimacy, but I don't know that she's even there. I don't know that she's far enough in her sort of relationship with her own desire to kind of know what that is that she's looking for, right? So in my mind, it isn't even so much that she feels that he makes her insecure. I think the world makes her insecure.
Yes.
And there's really very little that he could do, you know, to kind of feed that fill that hole, you know what I mean? Or sort of, feed that need. Now, there are some things he could do that would help, and there are some things that he does that definitely don't help, such
Like
as
telling her she'll never fit into the dresses
exactly.
does more harm than good. But I
Exactly.
guess as a reader, I tried to read underneath that, like,
Yeah.
I wish you would accept your body the way that
That's
it is because I
exactly.
love you. That's how I read the comment, even though it was subtextual.
Exactly. And so, and the difference between those two articulations of that comment is the anger that's, constantly there between them. And that anger is largely about their differing perspectives on Malaya's body, right?
Yeah.
So he's coming at her like, you'll never fit into these dresses. Why are you constantly trying to make our daughter fit into the dresses that you're buying for her? Right. And so I think absent of that, again, we'll never know. But absent of that, I imagine Percy as somebody who, yes, really just wants this whole diet thing to like go away for both of the women, for both his wife and his daughter. Now, but the other thing that he could do a lot better is like communicate with his wife, right? And like talk to his wife and, be vulnerable in a way that is difficult for him and is difficult in that relationship. In terms of Malaya's different intimate relationships, yeah, I mean, so this is where, much like hip hop, right? First of all, I will say, I think her relationship with the neighborhood and her relationship with Biggie as a kind of like specter, and with hip hop in general, this really is a major source of intimate connection for her. Obviously, it's abstract, but the way she feels, yeah, and
she finds pride in herself. I remember that feeling living near Harlem, like in Harlem. Like I remember feeling I wasn't from New York, of course, but I was like very proud. Like as a black person, very proud.
This is like a black world. Yeah, exactly. Pride, but I would also say a sense of connection, right? That we associate with intimacy. You know what I mean? Even if it's not a kind of like one-to-one in the moment, in real time connection, but just feeling seen. It's similar to what we were talking about with literature before we went live, right? Like that feeling of being seen. You can feel intimately connected to a character or to a rapper that you might, especially as a teenager. You know what I mean? Like those are real bonds, even if they're, we might now say parasocial bonds, right? But they're like real especially to a young person who's sort of forming their identity. But the other thing is that, her kind of crew at school, La Famille, right? They also represent a possibility of family, right? A possibility of intimate connection and community where she experiences acceptance, and that same kind of sense of being seen, right? And being felt. And so that goes a long way for her, especially when her family life is so fraught with all of this tension, the kind of, the lies, the miscommunication, and again, the arguments, a lot of which do sort of center around her body, the kind of crisis that her body seems to represent to her parents means that she can't feel that kind of intimacy there. She can feel some of it at school. And then, as you point out, she also seeks out the intimacy of touch, of sexual pleasure, of, sort of erotic experience, knowledge, right? Like she wants the intimacy of like erotic discovery. You know what I mean? She wants to feel, she wants to be, she wants to touch, she wants to taste, to do, and to learn about herself and her desire, like many humans do, like especially many teenagers do.
Yes.
And so to your earlier point, I mean, there's always been this interesting discourse in, rhetorics around basically within diet culture and rhetorics around fatness and bodies, right? The kind of hypothesis that like bigger women's bodies are efforts to protect oneself from a male gaze, right? The idea like you're either you're eating to protect yourself or you just are like calling the mass onto your body as like literal insulation from a masculine gaze. And I don't mean to, sort of dismiss that perspective. I know people who feel that reflects their experience. It did not reflect my experience, having grown up in a big Black woman's body. That was never my vibe. And if anything, part of that maybe is because if that was the goal, it didn't work, right? Because I mean, there are plenty of people of various genders, but especially I would say cishet men who are more than willing to sexually objectify a big woman's body or a big girl's body. And this is Malaya's experience, right? And so for her, she's seeking out intimate connection like on her own terms, right? Where her body is not an object of either derision or desire. You know what I mean? Where her body is like her own thing that she gets to inhabit and experience, and that she, in fact, can be the person who's kind of like seeking and searching, right? And looking for, again, connection, fulfillment, touch, pleasure. And Shanice ends up being where she finds that. And of course, the complexity and maybe irony is that Shanice is the one who ultimately is like, okay, but you got to go do you. You know what I mean? Like we can't stay here. Like you have to go continue to live and grow and learn, which in my view is like, that's real intimacy, like that's actual love in a way that Malaya hasn't quite experienced up until that point.
And so also thinking about the characters, your character construction is like immaculate.
Thank you, Jessica.
Because I think that there's a way that in American literature, especially, if we're thinking about a character like Malaya, we're thinking about them being, an underdog without mistakes.
Okay.
And in that archetype in literature of like the protagonist underdog, there's often a lack of complexity in those figures. But we see Malaya kind of taking in some of the spitefulness that comes from the gossip between her mom and her grandma, and kind of pointing it. We see her instances of envy, of jealousy. Absolutely. We see her instances of lack. We see her acknowledge it and then brush it off. But we see this in all of the characters. We're able to see the ways in which they're giving 120% to their family, their life, their love. But we also see the ways that society at large kind of restricts how radical that can be. And I just wanted to know more about your process of character construction, which also connects to the other question. How did you plan and strategize writing this out? As you said, it's not an experience that's strange to you. It's not an experience strange to me as a reader, what Malaya experiences. And I would have needed 1,000,000 days of self-care. Fighting through something this powerful and honest.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all of that. Yes, I needed 1,000,000 days of all kinds of things. I needed 1,000,000 days of work, 1,000,000 days of support, of feedback. You know what I mean? Like it was a long process. And I think for that reason, but in terms of, and I'll come back to that, but in terms of characterization and sort of building these characters, I do see Malaya as a hero, and I see her as a hero in the sense that I need my heroes to be, which is complex, right? Like, if what a hero does is sort of teaches us what we are capable of, then we also need to see what that character is up against, both externally and internally. You know what I mean? Beginning the narrative in her childhood is helpful because we can have compassion for her. We see where she's coming from, and hopefully the reader can have compassion for her that then will stick with us as we see her make choices that maybe aren't the best choices for her or for the people around her, right? And you're absolutely right. So the internalization of like the judgment of fat people, but especially of women in general, right? And sort of seeing how she, in some ways, is kind of carrying on the legacy that she's inherited, right? Like we see her grandmother pass body shame down to her mother and also sort of like enact it on her mother. You know what I mean? Naila does the same, passes that body shame onto Malaya, but also enacts it on her, right? Judges her, stigmatizes her. And Malaya is working through, okay, well, what do I do with all of this that I'm inheriting? And she absolutely does turn it outward on some of the people around her, especially Shanice, right? This is also where the class stuff comes into play. I think there are these moments where Malaya feels superior to Shanice, partly because, this is circulating in these conversations that her mother and grandmother are having as well, right? Like she looks cheap or she's too fast or whatever judgments women pass on one another and on little girls. And so Malaya she's seeing this as a source of power. She's seeing how these forms of judgment, which are really just coded forms of like, weaponized, internalized oppression, you know what I mean? Like in group, sort of systems of oppression that are operating among Black women. She sees how the women in her life seem to, extract like little fleeting moments of power from these interactions and from these judgments. And so she tries it out. Fortunately, I guess she tries it in a relationship that actually is a loving relationship. And Shanice is smart enough to kind of like see through it in a way, right? And like she's like, I see Shanice as almost like kind of like one of the like wise women figures, you know what I mean? Like if this were an allegory, for me, Shanice is kind of like a wise woman who sort of, who sort of gets it.
Are you okay?
I'm fine. It was a
Okay.
light down. But yeah, Shanice kind of gets it. So, I think given that the characterization of these characters really is just about like wanting them to feel like people. You know what I mean? I don't, you know, if there are heroes, there are multiple heroes. If there are villains, there are multiple villains. They can often be one and the same. And so it means a lot to me to hear that sort of comes through for you in the depiction of these characters. And in terms of the writing process, yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to write this novel. I was talking with a group of students in Milwaukee yesterday, and we were talking about how the very first draft of the novel was my master's thesis, like way, way back in the day. And it was a lot different. It was a lot longer. And I think that was about trying to kind of like, learn the story, but also figure out how to structure it in a way that would sort of tell the story as I felt it needed to be told, but also tell it in a way that the reader could really sort of stick with it, stay in it, stay in Malaya's experiences through the moments of triumph and the moments of trial. You know what I mean? And so there was a lot of kind of restructuring that went into that. In terms of my personal experience, yeah, I had a lot of community support while working on this novel. And
Beautiful.
I'm so grateful for that. Like really wonderful writing friends, who read drafts but also just like my people, you know what I mean? And I'm fortunate enough to have really good people in my life, some of whom knew me when I was having experiences similar to Malaya's. And so that sense of being in community, being seen, being known for a long time was really important. And the last thing I'll say is, and again, it might sound, trite or cheesy, but I really do see the community of like Black women writers, and Black women's novels as a community. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So there are certain books that I just went back to and read over and over again. Jamaica Kincaid, Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, that really helped me to sort of feel clear and confident in what I was trying to say and in the conversation I was trying to contribute to. You know what I mean? So in the moments when, it was difficult to write certain scenes, I had plenty of models of scenes that had been written beautifully in ways that I needed as a reader. And so again, the prospect of being able to offer that to others who might read my book, which is just it's almost too beautiful to really bear. You know what I mean? It's just an amazing thing to think of. And so that really sustained me through the challenging moments in the writing process.
So the last two questions I have are more about career.
Okay.
Because I remember it's only recently that it's become accepted that you may do an MA or an MFA and then do something that's near terminal and then go to a PhD,
right,
or do all kind of like, traditional BA, MA to PhD, and then become a creative writer.
Right.
So I wanted to ask about your trajectory and how your research and your academic writing meets or engages your creative work as well.
Yeah.
Because I think the last two generations of scholars have not only been scholars, but also been artists, either very openly or in secret.
Oh, that's right. That's exactly.
It comes from, I think, like this desire to stay as close as possible to your craft, period. At least that's why I know I went from an MFA to one terminal degree to the PhD.
Yeah, right.
It's to experience my craft in all forms as a way to strengthen. But I always ask these questions because I know that there's a possibility that there's a young writer out there who doesn't understand why the career path looks so different or why it's so hard.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to speak about your experience with your creative impulse and achievements, as well as the academic, and how you've managed that.
Absolutely. So yes, the young person out there who's wondering why this is so hard, they are right, because it shouldn't be, right? And I always start from a place of sort of acknowledging that these distinctions between, the work of or the job of a creative writer and the work or the job of a literary scholar, for example, those distinctions, I always say, are institutional, not intellectual, right? It is about, how you are going to, what kind of job you are trying to get. It is about, how a particular department or discipline imagines itself, how it structures itself. Often it's about sort of like funding streams within institutions, right? Like when we think, especially, I'm coming from my perspective as a Black queer feminist writer, our literary traditions have always been multi-genre traditions, right? Thinking back to our foundational writers, our foundational texts, we've invoked Audre Lorde several times. Like, that's because I, am an acolyte and a devotee and a stan of Lorde. She is somebody who, she is a poet. She is a theorist. She is an essayist. She's written stage works, right? She creates new genres, right? All of these things. And for her, as you said, the need to express oneself in multiple forms is part and parcel of sort of addressing intersecting power structures, the complexities of one's social and political and identitarian experience, right? That like, they're not antithetical to one another, right? It's an institutional imposition to say, oh, wait, are you a creative writer or are you a literary scholar? We can think back to foundational texts of Black studies, right? W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk is a hybrid text, right? There's theory, there's, arguably forms of criticism, or at least sort of like historical perspectives that engage literature. There are short stories. He's writing short stories, right? And so that notion that we, again, have to choose from a professional standpoint, sometimes we do, right? Or at least I definitely felt that I had to at times. But intellectually, I think it's important to remember that like, we don't need to place these limitations on our intellectual lives. You know what I mean? And so to your point, I think a lot of us sort of respond differently to that circumstance. What I ended up doing was kind of like deciding to do both. And that was definitely at a time where it didn't really feel like there was a sort of well-tread path toward doing both. I did find models. So like, the phenomenal poet and scholar Evie Shockley, the phenomenal poet and scholar Maida Jones, right? Several people I kind of sought out to be like, okay, I see you doing both of these things. I want to do both of these things. Like, let me apprentice myself to you. You know what I mean? Like, let me just like learn. Let me soak it in. How do I do this? And so, as you said, I feel like now I am in a point in so I'll just back up and say, look, for me, what that meant was honestly kind of just having two full careers for a long time. You know what I mean? Writing in both genres, writing actively, publishing actively in both spaces. Always feeling like a little bit of, not maybe fully in, or that I was constantly trying to be able to devote myself fully to both. The imagination and the intellect is infinite, but like time is finite, right? And so
Absolutely.
It was a negotiation, you know what I mean? Trying to figure, okay, how am I going to have these two careers and be in these two worlds? But I was committed to doing it because I really believed and still believe that, again, those distinctions are institutional, not intellectual. And if I can look to Lorde, to Morrison, to Shange, right, to all of these people who are writing to multiple audiences in multiple genres, in multiple ways, and doing it in ways that I needed them to do. Like, I needed all of their works, you know what I mean? Yes. There's no reason why I couldn't be able to do that myself. And so I feel very fortunate to now be in a place where, both parts of my writing are valued by my employer, but also in general, I feel like I'm able to have these conversations. And in fact, more importantly, I'm able to sort of like support artist scholars who are coming up now and talk about that, trajectory of the artist scholar experience that is, I think, very much a part of our literary and collective cultural history, even if, as you point out, it's only in the last, maybe 10 years or so that we're seeing like institutional spaces, sort of making space for these kinds of careers or these kinds of, intellectual lives. But I think it's important to remember, like, we've been doing this, you know what I mean? We've been artist scholars, and especially from a Black feminist perspective. I mean, that's our legacy, to carry on.
And what advice would you give someone who is kind of making these decisions? They're looking at an MA, they're looking at an MFA. They have this passion to write creatively, but they also have a passion to contribute to the kind of essayistic, more kind of academically prosaic dialogue about Blackness. What advice would you give them? What is the thing you wish that someone would have told you when you were staring down people's pressure to choose one?
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question. I think what I wish someone had told me was simply that it will not be easy, but you can do it. And I did have people who told me that. Herman Beavers is another person who, stood as a model of that possibility for me. I wish I had heard that message even more frequently, you know what I mean? But, yeah, just that, like, it is, and both of those things are true and important. It is very true that it is not easy, or it wasn't easy for me. Hopefully it's a little bit easier now, because again, I do think we're starting to see more institutional spaces sort of open up, and value these kinds of, dual careers or hybrid careers, however we want to think about them. But it isn't easy, because your work won't be legible in every space. And so, you'll have to do the additional work of making yourself legible, or being very selective about what spaces you enter and engage, and all of that is difficult work, especially when you're starting out in your career. So it won't be easy, but it is possible. And I would say, yes, seeking out those models, you know what I mean, is really important. And again, there are more of them. There are more of us now, right?
More and more, thank goodness.
Yeah, which is a beautiful thing. Because you're right. We need to have a future of artist scholarly kind of engagement, because these institutional divisions really cannot fully then articulate Black, fat, queer, feminist experience. You know what I mean? We need to be talking in as many languages as we can, to as many groups of people or communities as we can. And if you are compelled to occupy more than one of those conversations, I think you absolutely should. It won't be easy, but it is possible.
And I think it's also like our inheritance, right?
Absolutely.
Because even before we've had the century-long transformation as a people in diaspora, we come from places that have never really entertained this intellectual discretion between certain practices.
That's right. Absolutely. And I mean, we also come from traditions that value the intellectual, engagement and contributions of a wide range of communities and spaces, right? Like, coming from oral traditions in and of itself means that, our relationship with intellectual thought, with theory, with intellectual engagement, with criticism, right, is like, it stands outside of the white Western academic norm. You know what I mean? Like, we are coming in to this conversation from the outside in a certain way, unless we sort of just like, reshift the geography and decide that actually we are the center of the, intellectual universe. We've been doing these things in complex ways. We can keep doing it, and we can keep creating spaces where we can sort of show institutions that there is tremendous value to this kind of artist scholar engagement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mecca. It's been amazing. If you have not read Big Girl, go get Big Girl, a novel. Grab some tea, grab your tissue, get some other friends to read it, sit down, talk, and be not only amazed by how wonderful the text is as just an art piece, but be healed. Have the conversations. Let the text prime you for the conversations. We're so honored to have had you. It's been a fabulous conversation. I'm going to say goodnight, but I'll see you all back in February. February 28th, we'll be here with Dr. Etta Fields Black and her book, Combahee, which explores the history of the Combahee River region and Harriet Tubman's history related to it. Thank you all so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This was awesome.